Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session of Introduction to Latin America and the Caribbean 1. And today we're going to continue our discussion of these early years of establishment of the colonial society in Latin America and the Caribbean. This session is called the Age of Conquest and covers the next period. So last week when we were discussing America, Iberia, and Africa before the conquest, we also discussed the very first decades of colonial presence of the Spanish Empire in Latin America, mostly this period between 1492 and 1519. Remember, it's almost a 30-year period in which the first colony was established in what is today the Dominican Republic and Haiti, back then the island of Hispaniola. And this period of capital accumulation and like knowledge and experience to like set out the conquest of other regions of the continent. So we talk about 1492 to 1519 because in 1492 it was when Christopher Columbus arrives in the Caribbean, and all the way to 1519, between 1492 and 1519, the Spaniards are mostly in the Caribbean, right? Mostly in Hispaniola. They start moving to Puerto Rico, they start moving to Cuba, but they're mostly in this area of the region in the Caribbean. But then in 1519, one Spanish conquistador, Hernan Cortés, that we're going to discuss today, he moves to what today is Mexico looking for the Aztec Empire. And it's this movement that introduces the second period that we're going to discuss, which is roughly between 1519 and 1533. So it's a little bit more than 20 years, a little bit less than 20 years. And in this period, it's what we call now the Age of Conquest. So when we talk about conquest and we talk about the Age of Conquest, we're mostly talking about two things, okay? The conquest of the Aztec Empire in what today is Mexico, and the conquest of the Inca Empire in what today is Peru. So the idea with this session today is just to see how these two things work, how was conquest possible in these two scenarios, and then how that is different from what happened after, from 1533. So I mentioned 1533 because that's the year of the fall of the Inca Empire. So what happened after 1533, and what does it tell us about the establishment of colonial society in Latin America and the Caribbean? So let's start with the conquest of Mexico. What today is Mexico, what back then was the Aztec Empire. You see here representation of what was the siege of the city of Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan, as I mentioned last time, was the capital of the Aztec Empire, located in what today is Mexico City. So let's see the main characteristics of the conquest of Mexico. The first thing that we have to keep in mind is the previous colonial experience at La Hispaniola and the Hispaniola island that I just mentioned. And this is really important because it was in the Caribbean, it was in Hispaniola that the Spaniards realized that the Aztec Empire existed. Remember, conquest was basically a process of following rumors of wealth, like the Spaniards trying to figure out where they could go. To plunder more wealth from like these indigenous societies. And it's in the Caribbean that they hear, oh, if you go across the ocean into what today is Mexico, you're going to find a very, very powerful empire. And this accumulation of knowledge about indigenous societies has a very important part that I want also to mention, the second point in the PowerPoint slide: translators, right? Remember that before Columbus comes, before the arrival of this of the Spanish Empire, what's to become the Spanish Empire in the Americas, there was no contact between Europe and the Americas, so it was impossible for them to understand each other, right? The Spaniards are mostly going to speak Castilian, what today we call Spanish, and then you go to what today is Mexico, and you're going to have people speaking Maya, or you're going to have people speaking Nahuatl. Nahuatl was the language of the Aztec Empire. So it's very difficult. But then you have two very important historical characters that I want to bring up in this discussion. The first one is Jerónimo Aguilar. Jerónimo Aguilar was a Franciscan friar from Spain who was captured by the Mayas near what today is Playa del Carmen in like close to Cancun in Mexico. And he was captured by the Maya, and he stayed with them for almost 10 years. And the thing is that Jerónimo Aguilar actually learned how to speak Maya and a little bit of Nahuatl. And he became very, very important as a translator for Cortés, right? Cortés is like this big character that we're going to discuss at this point, because Hernán Cortés, the Spanish conquistador, was the one who took over the Aztec Empire. And the second character I wanted to mention, La Malinche, she was gifted to Cortés. And she learned Spanish and became also a very important translator. Translators were very important because when Cortés arrived with the Spaniards, right, with a group of Spaniards, the first thing they do is they have an audience with the Aztec emperor. And like they have the need to be able to communicate what they think and to have someone who is able to translate what the other part of the conversation is bringing into discussion, right? Like I just want to emphasize how important discussion of language is here, because it was impossible for them to understand between each other otherwise, without the help of translators. So in 1519, Cortés moves to Mexico, and just 2 years later, in 1521, he lays siege of the city of Tenochtitlan, today Mexico City, and the city falls under the control of the Spanish, right? So it's just 2 years, and so the question like comes up, right? Like, how did a very small group of Spaniards, under 1,000 people, right, led by Hernan Cortés, were able to conquer a very well established, powerful empire, centralized empire, such as the Aztec Empire, right? Like, that's the most important question that I want you to consider, especially when you engage with this particular period of Latin American history. And there's two parts of this. The first one, of course, is smallpox and other diseases. And why diseases are so important? Remember that when we were discussing the 15th century, this is well before the establishment of modern medicine, well before the discovery of vaccination, right, as a mechanism to stop the spread of diseases. So, how would you become immune to a disease like a smallpox in the 15th century, 14th century, 13th century in Europe? If there was no vaccination, right? Basically, right? If you were able to survive just with your own immune system, then you would survive the disease. But there was no way to train your immune system through the mechanism we use today and vaccines. So in Africa and Europe, there was already smallpox and other diseases in circulation, and people became immune over many, many generations. It was not a process like would happen with COVID, right? Like, we all got vaccinated in just a few months. The spread of the disease stopped significantly in the US and everywhere else in the world. Back then, you have to become immune throughout generations, right? If you became immune, you survived smallpox, that your children are going to have the genetic information to attack smallpox as well. So when the Spaniards moved to the Americas, right, and start the conquest of Mexico and other areas, they also bring diseases with them. Not necessarily like, don't think about this don't think about this as a purposefully used weapon of war, right? It's just something that they're bringing with them, right? They have diseases in circulation, such as smallpox. And the thing is that the indigenous inhabitants of the Americas had now built up immunity against smallpox, chickenpox, measles, and other diseases that the Europeans brought with them. And most of the population is going to die because of these diseases. In many cases, the diseases arrived to the indigenous societies way before the Europeans themselves arrived there. Like, these diseases travel really fast. In places like Hispaniola, in places like other islands in the Caribbean, we have registers of like pretty much 90% of the population or even more being wiped out in just a couple of years, many of them because of diseases. So, when this small group of Spaniards go against the Aztec Empire, it's a very, very, weakened army that they're going to find, because most of the fighting men of the Aztec Empire actually died because of smallpox and other diseases. So the first part, very important of the question to the question, how did a small group of Spaniards manage to take over a very well established empire as the Aztec? But the second is the use of native allies who resented the Aztec Empire. Remember, as I mentioned last time, the Aztecs were actually a very like they had the tendency of being an expanding empire. They would go over other societies. They would impose a tribute system, taxation, right? So for many of the societies that were under the control of the Aztec Empire, an alliance with the Spanish, who promised to oust the Aztec Empire, proved to be very much sought after. So we have people like, for instance, Tlaxcala people, which is today a city very close to Mexico City, that were actually allies. And so when the Spaniards attacked Tenochtitlan in 1521, it was not only the 1,000 people who came with them, right? It was also thousands of other like indigenous societies who gave soldiers to attack the city of Tenochtitlan, right? So it was this combination of uh, diseases, particularly smallpox, and the ability to ally themselves with enemies of the Aztec Empire, that's going to explain how a small group of Spaniards managed to conquer this very well-established empire. And the history in Peru, particularly with the Inca Empire, is going to be remarkably similar. Um, in this case, the conquistador Fernando Pizarro, also a Spaniard, he very well known. He very well knew how Cortés had been able to conquer the Aztec Empire, and he followed the same similar logic. So again, we have a previous colonial experience, first at La Hispaniola, but also then with the conquest of the Aztec Empire that Pizarro already knew about, right? He had some idea of what kind of empire he could be facing. But again, we have also here the presence of diseases, particularly smallpox. And in the case of the Inca Empire, smallpox reached right their country even before the Spaniards themselves. So one of the last emperors of the Inca Empire, Huayna Capac, he died of smallpox around 1530, and his heir also died because of smallpox, right? So you have the dissolution of the most important part of the political power in this empire. The emperor is gone and the heir is gone. So what you're going to have is the two other sons, Atahualpa, who became the last emperor of the Inca Empire, and his brother, he go into a civil war, right? So they go into a civil war over the control of the Inca Empire. And again, like this civil war was pretty much originated because Huayna Capac and his heir died of smallpox. So when the Spaniards arrived to the land of the Inca Empire, what they're going to find is a society in a very, very bad civil war. And the tactic of the Spaniards is to ally themselves with one part to defeat the other, and then to betray the people who they had allied themselves with in the first place. Very similar to what's going to happen in Mexico. So you see, there is a logic here, right? Again, ally yourself with the enemy of your enemy, right? And take advantage of the fact that diseases like smallpox and other are ravaging in these societies and killing thousands of people. And just think of the consequences that this kind of pandemic is going to have in the Inca Empire and other places in the Americas. Think like what was our life like in 2020 and 2021 because of COVID. And COVID had a death rate, most of the cases under 1%, 1.5%, like very, very low. And the entire world was stopped, right? There was no transportation. And, flying was not easy. Education was not working. People had to work from home. But back then, when we talk about the smallpox, the death rate is much, much higher in the 50s or 60% of the population who got infected that would die. So these societies were entirely destroyed by this pandemic. And on top of that, they had to face the arrival of invaders, in this case, the Spanish Empire. So in 1521, first and more important date, in 1521, Hernan Cortes takes over the Aztec Empire. In 1533, Pizarro takes over the Inca Empire after assassinating the last emperor of the Inca Empire, Atahualpa. But of course, that doesn't mean that there was no resistance, right? That the empire, like the Spanish Empire, the Spanish soldiers just go into these big empires in the Americas and just find no resistance at all. And particularly in the case of the Inca, there was a long resistance all the way to the 1570s against the presence of the Spaniards. When I told you like they take over in 1533 the Inca Empire, that means they take over the capital, right? Cusco, the city I told you about in Peru. But what happens right after that is that two factions of the civil war, remember the two brothers I told you that were leading two different factions that went into war over the Inca throne, reunited to attack the Spaniards. And by 1536, we know from reports produced by the Spaniards themselves that they had grouped an army of probably more than 100,000 people with which they attacked the Spanish troops. Even though like they were able to like regroup this fast just 3 years after the assassination of Atahualpa, they were not able to defeat the Spaniards, and they went to another region in northern Peru called Vilcamba, right? And the last ruler of the Incas, Manco Inca, ruled an independent kingdom in there until 1572 when it fell under the control of the Spanish Empire as well. But just this, for you to give you a sense that when we talk about conquest, it's not like the Spaniards arrived in 1492 and 30 years after, they control an entire continent. It's much more focalized, right? It was in Mexico, the Aztecs, in Peru, the Incas. That was the extent of conquest. And then a slow expansion that we're going to see over the next following. So far we have pretty much discussed the case of Spanish America, right? The portions of Latin America and the Caribbean that were conquered by the Spanish Empire. But remember, it was not the only one. Less than 10 years after Christopher Columbus arrived, Pedro Alvarez, a Portuguese merchant, arrived to what today is Brazil, right? But the conquest of Brazil is going to be very, very different than the conquest of Mexico and Peru by a very fundamental fact. Remember when we were discussing the different kind of indigenous societies in the Americas, we talk about hunters and gatherers, semi-sedentary and sedentary population, right? The conquest like performed by the Spaniards was against sedentary populations, against the Incas and the Aztecs. But in the case of Brazil, there was no centralized, wealthy, urbanized Amerindian society in the region. They're not going to find a big empire. They're mostly going to find like hunters and gatherers and semi-sedentary populations who very fast start moving across the rainforest, both the Atlantic rainforest and the Amazon rainforest, away from the coast. Because most of the colonies of the Portuguese Empire in Brazil are going to be established in the coast. And if you look at the map of Brazil, most of the cities, the most important cities of the country are on the coast. Sao Paulo, Recife, Salvador Bahia, Rio de Janeiro, like all of these are on the Atlantic coast. The capital, Brasilia, is in the middle of the country, but it was just built in the 20th century. It's way, way after that. So all the presence of the Portuguese Empire is going to be on the coast, and the native population is start to flee from that area. If you can see in this map, like this is supposed to be the coast of Brazil that I was telling you about. You can see here like the name Brasília, right? Where does the name Brazil comes from? Well, it was because the first trade that the Portuguese established was of Brazil wood, a kind of tree you can see portrayed here, you see? So the name of the country comes from the tree. So there was no centralized, wealthy, urbanized empire of Amerindian society in the region. So what's going to happen is the native population managed to resist labor demands, right? And the Portuguese very fast turned to enslavement, right? To a very violent way of compelling the indigenous population to work for them. Um, and to work for them, like doing that, we're going to see that in the next few sessions. But pretty much what's going to happen in Brazil is the establishment of sugar plantations, right? So you have the indigenous slavery, like the expansion, like a slow expansion of Portugal, not as fast as the Spanish again, because there was no centralized empire to take over. But when the Portuguese settlers and the Portuguese empires in general, its soldiers go after the indigenous population, you're going to have a very similar picture, which is demographic collapse, right? People dying from warfare, people dying from exhaustion in slavery, people dying from diseases. Again, smallpox is going to ravage the entire country very, very, very fast. And as indigenous labor disappear because of the demographic collapse of the indigenous population, really fast they're going to be replaced with enslaved Africans, right? To support sugar production. That's why today Brazil is the country with more people of African descent outside of Africa. I think it's around 95 million people as of today. That comes from all of these Africans who were captured in Africa and brought, kidnapped and brought as enslaved labor to work in the sugar plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean. So, considering the experience of the Incas, the Aztecs of Brazil, what does it tell us about conquest and what happens after, right? The aftermath of conquest. So, the first idea that I want you to keep in mind is there was no coherent plan, right? It was not as Christopher Columbus arrived and he knows, oh, the Aztec Empire is here, the Inca Empire is here, the Portuguese arrived. So, like, oh, we're going to just find all the Tupi speaking indigenous peoples and for them to work in sugar plantations. They were mostly following rumors of wealth, right? Remember, they go to Hispaniola, and Hispaniola, they hear about Mexico, in Mexico, they hear about the Incas. They're just following rumors of wealth. We also can conclude that people living in highly centralized societies, such as the Inca Empire and the Aztec Empire, were easier to conquer, right? Again, because if you have a pyramid of power, the only thing they had to do was to replace the top, to replace the emperor for someone else, and then they're going to control the entire political structure. But people living in decentralized political structures, such as the Mayas, resisted more effectively the conquest of the Mayas, as a matter of fact was only finalized in the 19th century, even after the independence from the Spanish Empire. So you can see the difference between the Mayas and the Incas here. And the last thing is that Europeans reached their territorial limits in the Americas by the late 1500s, right? They took over these particular areas, but it's not like they take over the entire continent. You can see that clearly in this map. This is basically the outcome of the Age of Conquest. You have this portion up here, right? That's going to be the Aztec Empire in present-day Mexico. You have this part here around Lima, that's going to be the Inca Empire, present-day Peru, Colombia, Bolivia, Ecuador, and others. And this small part here is the first colonies of the Portuguese in Brazil. But you see, the Age of Conquest is now taking over the entire continent. They only had control by the late 1500s of these areas in yellow. And actually, as we are going to see throughout our classes, they never control, like the European empires never controlled the entire continent. At the moment of independence in the 1810s, 1820s, there were still many indigenous societies in the Amazon rainforest, in the central part of North America, in this northern part of Chile and Argentina, that were never conquered by the Spaniards. Okay, so again, it was no a coherent plan, and they just controlled this. And what's going to happen in the following years is a slow expansion of the European empires, particularly the Portuguese and the Spaniards, from these areas that they control into other areas. Then you have, of course, the rivals of the French, the Dutch, the English, who also take part of the conquest and colonization of the Americas.